let's learn how to use sci-fi conceits. So a lot of people think of sci-fi as an aesthetic these days, and that's like buying a really nice bicycle because it looks great and then refusing to learn how to ride it. So let's get those wheels turning. Let's learn how to ride sci-fi. Let's learn how to make sci-fi conceits. A sci-fi conceit is simply any part of the sci-fi universe that is different from how it is in reality, or how it would be in reality. For example, warp drive, or aliens, or the fact that spaceships exist at all. Because these things don't really exist in reality in the way they exist in the universe of our fiction, we can do whatever we want. It's not just technology either. We can have physical things like, oh, here's a weird alien monster that doesn't seem to follow any rules of biology that we know about, or here's some psychics. Or we can have social stuff like, oh, here's the Federation, or here's that society in Logan's Run where they kill everybody at age 24. These are all conceits because things like this wouldn't work in reality in the way they work in our fiction. Which means anything goes. Because no real-world rules apply, we can make up whatever rules we want. And sci-fi is particularly good at this as opposed to something like fantasy because we can just hand-wave it and say, it's technology, instead of having to actually try and explain it. Logan's Run kills everybody at age 24. Why? Because they can. There's technology that supports the entire society. They don't need anybody older than age 24 to actually run any of the machinery or anything like that. This is the power of sci-fi. Because we can make these conceits do whatever we want, we should obviously make them do the things that make our narratives work. I'll give you an example. You're making a generic sci-fi story, and that means you just want some generic sci-fi shenanigans, right? Let's say warp drive. You want warp drive. Okay, well, what about warp drive do you actually want? I don't mean to ask you how the tachyon flow inverts or whatever. How does your warp drive work in a narrative sense? Does it require a huge mothership? Does it require gates? Does it get stapled to whatever ship, size needs it so that basically everybody has it? These answers produce radically different narratives. If it requires a mothership, for example, then many of your narratives are going to be about returning to a mothership, fixing a mothership, finding a mothership, destroying a mothership, and so on. Similarly, anybody entering or leaving local space is going to do it with a massive entourage, because it requires a mothership. Making a different choice would lead to a different kind of narrative in those situations. So obviously, you should choose the kind of conceit that actually helps you tell the stories you want to tell. And this is true of every aspect of these, right? Like, oh, can your warp drive take you into gravity wells? Can it take you close to a star? Because that is going to change things like how combat works and how shipping works and all that jazz. These are all things that can change the flow of your narrative. Now, in short narratives like books or one-off books or movies, this sometimes gets really aggressive. Like sometimes you'll see books or movies where the sci-fi conceits are a one-to-one perfect match with the story they want to tell. The only reason those sci-fi conceits exist in the first place is because of the story they want to tell. Interstellar is a really obvious example of that, right? We've got this dude whose emotional journey is that he wants to, he wants to be there for his family. He wants his family to survive and love each other and all that happy stuff. And so he goes through this sci-fi sequence where at some point he finds himself able to telekinetically control things in his daughter's room 20 years ago. And it's like, that's a conceit. And it's a conceit that is only useful for this one particular story. The problem is that when you get down that far, it starts to become psychedelic sci-fi, which is another topic entirely. But the other problem with that is because it's so aggressively locked in, you can't really use this kind of sci-fi conceit, this kind of ultra-targeted sci-fi conceit, in a larger framework. Most games, for example, go on for like 20 hours or more. There is a lot more in that universe than this one guy's arc. You have to let the rest of life in, at least a little bit, because there's just so much time that the player has to spend in this universe. It can't be 100% focused on this one guy's emotional journey, because that just wouldn't fill up the time. In addition, we've also got things we have to do in that world, and again, it's hard to make all of those things directly relate to this guy's emotional journey if you want your game to be longer than a movie. Because of this, most sci-fi universes used in games or serials or, whatever, they're going to be defined not with a specific narrative in mind, but with narrative enabling in mind. And a good example of that would, of course, be Star Trek, which has teleporters. Ooh, beam me up, Scotty. Now, the teleporters are famously because they didn't want to continuously film shuttle shots, but they allow the actors to go down onto the planet's surface, or the characters to go down to the planet's surface really, really fast and back, and you can just have all sorts of very snappy storytelling that doesn't involve a lot of trying to cross vast distances manually, because that travel time would be a huge factor in every story if they didn't have teleporters. And it's the same with the hologram suite, the holodeck. In the TNG and afterwards, the holodeck exists specifically to allow the storytellers to tell zany stories taking place in worlds that don't even exist in the fiction of the universe. In the original Star Trek, that wasn't required because they were willing to tell zany stories that actually were in the fiction of the universe. Oh, here's a purple planet full of flying flapjacks. They can just make a planet like that. They don't have to be zany. They don't have to worry about how zany it is, because at the time they were willing to be zany. When the series settled down a little bit, they needed a place to put their zaniness, so they put it in the holodeck. The holodeck doesn't enable a specific story. It's not there to tell one specific story and nothing else. It's there to enable every zany story that they want to tell, and some other ones besides. It's a tool to allow them to tell a specific kind of narrative. And guess what? Every universe is designed like this. Any successful universe that you can point out that's sci-fi based is going to have sci-fi conceits that help it to tell the story that it wants to tell. Oftentimes, this customization happens at the edges. So, for example, if we look at Mass Effect, they've got this warp travel system, which is it's not exactly a gate, it's like an assist vehicle that shoots them around the universe. And they don't really make a big deal about it, and it's pretty much treated like normal sci-fi warp drive. But there's no such thing as normal sci-fi warp drive, because those details are what let you tell the story that you want to tell. And as you know, if you have ever heard of Mass Effect, the warp drives existing, the warp gates existing before we even get to the stars is a huge part of the story. Because this conceit is such a tiny little tweak from what we were expecting, you might think that it's not going to have much of an effect, but that tiny little tweak is actually the hinge, the lever on which the entire plot revolves. That's how important it is to think about your sci-fi conceits. Even a tiny little change can set up your literal entire narrative. So when you think about sci-fi, don't think about it as just an aesthetic. Think about what the conceits of the setting are, whether they're technological or physical or social, and understand the stories that's helping you to tell. And if you're only trying to tell one story, make conceits that explicitly help you tell that one story. It'll be far more memorable with more interesting, unusual conceits, more unique conceits, than just slightly tweaking the ones that you think are normal. There's no reason why these are the normal conceits anyway. It's just random chance that we happen to have settled on this generic sci-fi universe. If you don't need it, don't use it. Find other conceits that work for you better. Have a good one.